Hello, I'm Natalie Kunsman, MD, and today we are talking about obesity. And obesity is simply defined as having too much fat. And it's classified in three major categories based upon your BMI, such that we have class 1, 2, and 3. And 1 is defined as a BMI of 30 to 35, 2 is 35 to 40, and 3 is severe with a BMI greater than 40. Now that system is very simplistic for a very complex set of factors that determines someone's health, but it is at least what we have right now as a means to describe somebody's weight. Now, in the US, obesity has increased threefold in the past 40 years. And I guess the question becomes, is obesity as simple as calories in and calories out? And the answer is no. So hold on to your fats, because the research is leading in places we did not think this would go. So this lecture is going to take some twists and turns that I don't think you've expected. So here's the basic question. What makes us fat? Many healthcare providers now are at least acknowledging that fats and lean proteins and vegetables do not make us fat, but sugars and carbohydrates are a big contributor. But why is that? There is a term, and it's a new term, called obesogens. And obesogens could be any source that we are ingesting that's causing obesity to occur. And sugar and high fructose corn syrup are common ones. But here are some more. Chemicals and pesticides. Animal proteins with fats, and that's mostly because of some of the toxins we're going to talk about store in animal fats as well, and especially those that are wrapped in saran wrap rather than paper. So, tap water. Why would tap water? Well, tap water has pesticides that leach into the water table. We have everyday household items in the US that can contribute to obesity. There are about 10 herbicides, several fungicides, more than a dozen insecticides, industrial chemicals to include cadmium, lead, styrene, dioxins BPA, bisphenols, manganese, methylmercury, and heavy metals. So let's think about that. We know that these can cause obesity because we've had many mice studies, whereas I'll just give one example, that mice were fed identical calories, but one group received an injection of a toxic substance, and there were several of these toxic substances that were tested one at a time. And the toxic mouse, or the toxic mice, were up to 36% fatter on the same identical calories. There are some reasons theorized and proving correct about why these toxins may cause obesity, and we think some of it is related to the burden to the liver and the skin and the kidneys detoxifying mechanism. So, hear me out. The body will compensate to protect the inner clockwork of the body, and it creates a holding tank for these toxins to store. So if you want to find a lot of white fat, you're going to find a lot of toxic debris. Many of these toxic chemicals that I mentioned, and certainly the list is not complete as we are discovering, many of the toxic chemicals will act as endocrine disruptors. So endocrine hormones in the body are, for example, thyroid, ovarian, some of our adrenal and stress hormones, and our hunger and satiety hormones. So disrupting the stress hormones, for instance, that will increase to a glucose-based steroid response. Disrupting the hunger hormones will alter, obviously, when we feel full or hungry. And some of those well-known hunger hormones are ghrelin, leptin, and adiponectin. Disrupting the thyroid can render it ineffective and slow down, which can alter our metabolic rate. There is then hormonal regulation of the fat cells themselves that can create more fat cells or increase more storage in the existing fat cells, and whether or not those cells are going to increase insulin sensitivity. So we probably need a moment to digest all of this. Many of the chemicals we've mentioned thus far may be in manufacturing and farming, but also in plastics. And then thus they may leach into the soils or water and the plants that we are consuming from the farms, and getting these substances are getting into us in this capacity. So yes, in America, we are allowing this to happen when in most countries, this is not allowed. So now I'm often wondering, maybe we need Western medicine because we have a Western diet. Americans are obese, and Americans are toxic. What is even worse is that our FDA allows these food additives that may actually boggle your mind. Azodicarbonamide and datum are bread additive to bleach out the flour, but they're also additives to the bread themselves to keep a longer shelf life. But it is also found in rubber and plastics like flip-flops and yoga mats. So not only is our bread a dense carbohydrate, but it is also laden with toxins that want to rid themselves and store and deposit in adipose. Brominated vegetable oils actually will help some of the food dyes adhere to the water molecules for the power drinks that are very colorful and some slushies. The bromine will displace iodine in the thyroid and render it low functional. The list is growing, and for instance, even arsenic has made its way into our vegetation and the feed that the chicken are consuming, and that's been pretty common in the press over the past year or two. So fat doesn't just sit on the body. If it did, it wouldn't be a health problem, but the fat cells themselves secrete leptin and adiponectin, which actually help with hunger. So resistin and TNF-alpha also are chemicals or hormonal regulators that are secreted by our fatty tissue, and that promotes insulin resistance. Then we have the fats, the adipose tissue that may liberate free fatty acids, and we've talked about the free fatty acids in our fatty liver discussion and how those will interplay with insulin sensitivity in our cells and contribute to the fatty liver and type 2 diabetes. Now, also, we have some inflammatory markers getting secreted from our fat cells, such as interleukin-6 and VEGF, which actually is pro-inflammatory and promotes angiogenesis. And again, this is very complex information that we'll save for another day when we're talking about inflammation itself. And this is extremely complicated, so I really hope I didn't lose you. So what I'd like to do is reel us back into the basics with our obesity discussion today. So we just learned about a lot of the chemicals getting into our food that are contributing to the obesity, such that it is not as simple as calories in and calories out. Obesity has some other classic contributors, such as sleep deprivation, will yield to increased cortisol and increased calorie consumption. We are now having lots of research about our gut bacteria, and there are gut bacteria ratios such that, in a very crude sense, let me backtrack a little bit. We have about 100 trillion bacteria on our skin, in our guts, in our nasal passages, such that for every human cell, for each human cell, we have about 10 bacteria. So we are not just feeding ourselves, we are feeding them. So there are many different species and many different subtypes of bacteria, but to keep this discussion very simple, if we could keep our ratios heavily in the Bacteroidetes versus the Firmicutes bacteria groups, we can create more of the food and toxins that may either keep us lean, Bacteroides, or keep us obese, Firmicutes. So as we're thinking of a lot of our cravings and the chemicals and the toxins that we are ingesting, we are altering that ratio. So obviously, sugars and the carbohydrate family contribute to the Firmicutes family, and the high fiber diets are contributing to the Bacteroides species. So what are the take-home messages? Well, obesity may not entirely be yours to blame, with all of these hidden toxins that are in our environment affecting the epigenetics, so affecting the genetic profile we've inherited. But you must clean up the act to lose weight. It is not as simple as cutting calories and working out, although those are two key components. We must be as much organic as possible and plant-based as we possibly can be. So the higher up the food chain, so that the more apt that the animals, especially the mass farm animals up the food chain, who are also injected with hormones and consuming all of these plants lower in the food chain, they are absorbing these toxic pesticides from not only the plant life, but the water, and they are also storing it into their own fat. And yes, studies are showing that our pets and our animals are getting fat right along with us. Wash all of your vegetables well. Buy organic. Avoid plastics, including meats wrapped in saran wrap. Watch the breads. And I have just double-checked some of the breads that I thought were good breads, and they still are harboring the datum in there. A lot of our fast foods contain many of these no-nos that I've just mentioned. Sugar is a toxin. It is not needed for our survival, and it not only is putting weight on from a caloric, dense calorie perspective, but also from a toxic perspective. Speaking of, consider detoxification strategies, and you may actually want to measure what toxic burden you may have in your bodies. And this is a lot of the integrative techniques that I will bring into my practice, such that we can measure in a deeper dive what's in our bodies and potentially start considering liver detoxification programs, food detoxification programs. I also think you should demand answers when your thyroid is underactive or your hormones aren't acting properly, and ask for some of these more aggressive tests to figure out what toxic burden you may have. Consider reverse osmosis water filtration systems in your home. Avoid the food dyes, additives, aspartame, sweeteners, processed foods, and things that are deep fried. And that's mostly because the oils are of GMO and manufactured and cut into that food processing. So here we go. Veganism, ketogenic with the right components to ketogenic, paleo dieting that endorses very good high vegetation, but when we're considering our protein components, we have to keep them organic, grass-fed, pasture-raised, and in very small amounts. Also, we would want to avoid some of the highly GMO veggies, which is genetically modified, such as the corn, soy, and wheat. And where this comes to play is a little bit different than you might think. When we have modified these plants to be higher resistance for pestilence and maybe even higher resistance for pesticides, they may resist it, but they are still absorbing it in high quantities within the plant itself and still has high pesticide quantities. So take a breather. Maybe we need to watch this video a few times because this was heavily laden with a lot of information. There is nearly a mouse study for nearly every one of these chemicals we've discussed. And I did not even get into the antibiotics that we are supplying into our bodies. And when we do antibiotic studies that are shifting the bacteria ratio, yes, indeed, those mice are getting fat too. So we need to keep our bodies clean, keep it simple. And we are, again, just scratching the surface with this topic. So when you are having difficulty losing weight, consider your toxic burden, consider what you might be ingesting, clean up the act, and consider going through some integrative techniques to investigate your toxic burden and how you may be able to clean up your dietary intake. So again, we're going to have multiple topics of this in the future. This was just scratching the surface. I appreciate your time and attention on this topic. Certainly give me any more topics you would like to discuss. Subscribe to my channel. We will be putting out lots more information that is current, relevant, and to help you live day to day a good life. Until we meet again, be well.